Hello to everybody. Hello, everybody. We are starting the last, but not least, panel of the 5th International IBCI conference. And I'm very glad to have here with us Professor Thibault Schrepel. Professor Thibault, I'm sure is well known of all of you. Professor Thibault is professor at VU Amsterdam and Stanford universities, and is a leading professor dealing with blockchains, AI, and so forth and so on. So I'll be really glad to have Professor Thibault showing us the state of the art of his work involving API and antitrust, or API antitrust. Professor Thibault, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, Eduardo, always good to be with you. I don't know if I should disclose that, but you promised me that next year will be in person. So to everyone listening to us, who knows? Hopefully we could meet in person somewhere in the world. But for now, I think we do it digitally. It's Friday night here in Europe, and I do realize that it's quite a challenge to stay focused on a Friday night. So I try my best to make it attractive and dynamic. It's the title of this presentation, and it's not immediately clear why this will be called dynamic, but I will come back to this specific point at the very end. What I can tell you already is that if you discuss new tools, new ways by which you may understand, apply, enforce antitrust, I think it leads to dynamism. But just keep that in mind for now. Okay. What I want to do, and the way we've decided to structure the panel or the conversation is the following. As you can see, there is the first bubble entitled Making an API. I will explore this, and then we can have a discussion for some time before I move on to the lessons, or at least what I got out of the process. The good thing with such an international crowd is that I see where you could actually try to develop something similar and probably better in your countries, your own home countries, especially with Brazilian law, but that's something to be discussed. So that's the approach we've been taking today. So without further ado, let me explore the first one and tell you a bit about what I will be discussing today. So we have created a project within Stanford University Codex Center entitled Computational Antitrust. Now we have 65 competition agencies, a bunch of scholars, a fantastic team of young practitioners and scholars working on that. And the basics of what we do is that we try to combine antitrust law that we've been discussing throughout the 5th annual conference and computational law. Now, computational law is a very straightforward concept. The idea is to use what we called computation, or differently put, computer-based problem-solving methods. So anything that relies on a computer, and to apply that to the law. So concrete example of computational law would be designing a software where you compute the laws of the land, such as, you know, the height of a building and how far a building should be removed from the one of your neighbors. You compute all that, you transpose all the laws into a software, and then you may simulate putting a new building on your field, and automatically, if the building is red, it says, well, you are not complying with the law. And if the building, you know, appears in green, it means that, yes, the way you want to construct the building is actually compliant with the law. That's a good example of computational law. And what we do is here we try to combine the two. That makes, as you can see over here, Jerry Seinfeld very happy. It also makes me very happy and enthusiastic, and I'm going to try my best to make you very happy on a Friday night or afternoon if you are in Brazil. So that's the logic of what we do. Now, most of what we've been doing, for I think good reasons, is to explore what I will call the way by which we can fight fire with fire, and the two swords. I'm sure you're aware, especially if you've been through the conference, that companies are investing in new tools. The vast majority of time, this is good for consumers, but it might also be that they want to use those tools AI, and others to infringe the law. Now, agencies in the past, up until very recently, were relying on old tools and old methods for a bunch of different reasons. I can discuss that if you want me to. It was for the lack of technical expertise, also the fear of using tools where you don't control the results, so good reasons. What we see now is that those agencies are moving toward the use of computational tools. I think this is great. It comes with challenges, and this is what we research at the Stanford University Codex project. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples of where we can fight fire with fire, and especially if you are a practicing lawyer, things that you could do. One of the first paper that we published, and you do have a little QR code, but if you just Google, everything is open access. So you could access everything that I will present in the coming minutes. One of the first that we published comprises to the use of machine learning to better understand the case law and the movement you may see in court decisions. So what those researchers did is that they analyzed thousands of antitrust cases in the United States, and from that derived tendencies. So you may see, for instance, that tying cases are not so popular anymore, that generally speaking, in one specific sector, the pharma sector, this type of practice is the most litigated, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why this might be seen as confrontational is because this might be very harmful and come handy to competition agencies, because indeed, if you do the work as a competition agency and you see that the number of tying cases that you've been litigating is on decline, it may be two things. It may mean that first, there are less tying practices on the market, but if we don't think that's the case, it may mean that you need to invest more and put more case handlers in trying to identify tying cases, right? So in a way, you will use the tool to better enforce antitrust against the companies that are infringing antitrust. So that's one type of solution. A second type of solution, a paper that I very much enjoyed that we also published, is here tackles merger control. I'm sure you've heard about killer acquisitions. We could discuss the terminology. I think there are not killer acquisitions because you have to be accepted to be killed, which is kind of probably more of a suicide or something different, but not a killing per se. But in any case, the idea is that big tech companies, especially, or in the pharma sector, will buy the small companies to prevent competition. Whether or not they will then stop the production of the product or service is a question to be debated. But in any case, we know that there is a challenge. Indeed, if you acquire a young target, you will be below the threshold. You don't have to notify the merger, and the worry that we may have killer acquisitions. Now, using computational tools, and what the researchers from the MIT have done in this paper is that they have found a way to identify, using computational tools, which of the targets, which of the startups will have a chance of becoming a disruptor and eventually creating real strong competition on the market. What they come up with is what they call the fitness of a company, which is the link between the potential growth of a company and the connection that this company has with other companies and other products and services. The more, the better. And what's very interesting is that they have done the empirical work, measured that over time, and indeed, you see that there is a strong connection between the company growth and the connections. It's not perfect, but it tells you something as a competition agency that instead of simply relying on threshold, where you look at the turnover, and eventually in the analysis where you look at the market shares, well, you could do something more and analyze here the fitness of a company, right? So if you are interested, again, you can read the study. But again, we see that this is where agencies may use computational tools to better enforce antitrust versus the companies, or here, the acquirers. Very last example, policies. So after the practices and merger, now policy. We haven't published yet anything on it, but it's coming. What I want to show you here is something that is called agent-based modeling. If you are interested in agent-based modeling, it could get quite complex. So this is not the type of solution that you implement without computer science expertise, but still, you could download for free, it's open source, a software called NetLogo and start designing your own simulation. Now, let me just have a look at what appears here on just above me. What you may see, and to be clear, this is not the result of this very specific simulation, but what it could be is the result of a simulation where, for instance, you will ask your computer to simulate where agents, meaning companies or consumers, will go depending on what's available to them. Let's imagine that those consumers are price sensitive and privacy sensitive to different degrees. One consumer may care only about prices, the other one may care only about privacy, and so on and so forth. You create a simulation, you ask the computer to generate, let's say, 4 million of those agents, each with different set of preferences, and then you see how they behave. Should they want to research something on the net, and should they only have access to one company? What do? Let's say that this could be the result. Well, most agents, whether they are price or privacy sensitive, will use the service because there is only one, except for those two agents who would say, I won't research the internet if I have to sacrifice my privacy. But now, if you have some more competitors, I won't name names, but let's say a search engine where it's better for your privacy, although the result may be less good, then what do? Where do the agents go? To see that in action, I've put here a video of such an agent-based modeling that relies on machine learning, and here especially deep learning. And what you see is that you could play the game several times and the agents will learn from the behaviors of the other agents, which is exactly what we see on the market. Keep that in mind, because discussing dynamism, I think we are getting closer, rather than just taking a picture and saying there is an average consumer, right? We've never met anyone average. And so here what you could do is that you could get closer to seeing in the real space what's happening. Now, if you want to enact the AI Act, something that we've discussed in this conference, or the DMA, or laws in Brazil or in the United States, what it can tell you and show is where the agent will go, how they will react, will they exit the market, stay on the market, and so on and so forth. But again, what you here do is that you use computational tools to better enforce the law. Now, from this perspective, very confrontational, I thought that, and to be clear, this is more than necessary and logical that we start there. But I thought, what if we were to design a computational solution that, instead of being confrontational, will help companies better comply with the law? And it may come as a surprise to some of my students, where, because they only study the case law, they may get under the impression that companies want to infringe antitrust. That's the purpose for which they were created, which is not true. Most companies want to comply with the law. Now, antitrust is very complex or complicated, and therefore it seems to me that if agencies were to provide some new tools to companies, they could be in a better position and comply more easily. And this is where, as you indeed introduced, Eduardo, I disclosed the antitrust API, which I just published last week. It's a proof of concept, which means it's not perfect, it's not complete by any means, but it just shows how to design a similar API. And that's exactly what I want to cover with you in just a few minutes. I want to show you how it works, and then we could go to the Q&A for this part. So first, let me show you what you have to do. And it's a very interesting exercise for students, researchers, PhD candidates, professors, practitioners, competition agencies. Because what you have to do, or at least the way I've approached that, is that I translated EU competition law, especially regarding abuses of dominance, into decision trees. And if you want people to be able to use your API, such as I will show you in a minute, you have to be understandable by those people, by non-competition experts, which means you have to translate competition law in layman terms, right? Which is a very complex exercise, because you don't want to lose too much in the process of the translation. And yet, if you keep on asking questions based on competition law concept, no one will be able to use the API. So there's no point. Now, that's the background of it. it looks like a lot. It's actually, I mean, it takes quite some time to develop, but it's something that you could totally do. Now, what I want to do here is just to give you an overview of one of those decision trees, the one that I've made for rebates and discounts. Again, just EU competition law. I'll be curious to see if you could design that in Brazil or in other countries, jurisdictions. But what you can see here is that I've indeed put into decision trees the entire legality tests. And when it's green, it means that, well, the rebate here is lawful. There are always exceptions. Sometimes I'm not that confident, so I say you are likely not implementing a rebate because the case law is hard to read. And I would just do my best not to mention those post-its because this is what I want to discuss in part 2. So I just wanted to show you that, well, if you answer yes to all of those questions, then you get to a red situation, which is that you may infringe antitrust. Now, of course, it's very important if you design such an API that companies are able to use it in an anonymous way, because otherwise you can be sure they will always answer no to your question because they don't want to be fine liable by a computer, right? And then the agency to knock on the door to say, hey, you've answered yes, please give me the money. So that's what you see. And now, after you've done that, there are different softwares that you can use. The one that I use is called Berkeley Bridge. And I will just show you how it looks like so you get a sense of the final result. So if you just give me a minute, I will actually get to it. And we can, I guess, take it from there and indeed discuss the limitations of the API. So, all right, where is my API? It's over here. I will just share my screen with you so that you can actually see the way it works in practice. Oh, all right. And then I need to share this. Okay. So, by the way, you can also access that interface. You get the password. It's free in the paper. Where I've put the QR code, I could also put it in the chat, but if you just Google antitrust API, you'll find it. So this is how it looks like. First, of course, you have to assess dominance. So let me take the easy path. Then I've designed the API in a way to be able to direct companies towards which practice they would like to assess. Here, I'm asking whether or not they would like to assess their pricing policy. So I've grouped all the antitrust cases that are related to price strategies. If I answer no, then I'm asking, would you like to assess the compliance of your policy with non-pricing strategies? If you answer yes, then you get to the most common types of practices: exclusive dealing, patent holdup, refusal to deal, tying, and a few others. So if I go back to refusal to deal and say, yes, I'm interested in that, then you navigate the exact decision tree that I showed you, right? Are you supplying a tangible asset? No. Well, then you are not refusal to deal in a way that is prohibited according to Article 1 and 2. But if you then want to potentially be interested in getting more information, such as whether you supply an asset that is non-tangible, then you will get to, again, navigate the API, and hopefully you will reach a final state which is clear, right? Same for patent holdup. You get asked a few questions, and depending on what you answer, you get to the result. Well, yes, you are infringing the law. No, you are not infringing the law. So that is what I wanted to show you. Again, you can access the API. It's available, and you find the link in the paper that appeared on the screen. And I guess I can stop here, and we can discuss because you must have questions already.
Sure, Thibault. I'm just changing the gallery. Okay. Well, amazing, I would say. Thank you very much for this first part. Well, I took some notes, I must confess, but from the end note to the first ponderation, is that right? I mean, can I understand this antitrust API you created as like a digital compliance test for antitrust? I mean,
yes, yes, but it can be more than that. And it brings me to one of the limits. So I will keep that for later. But indeed, it's an API in a sense that what you could do is that you could plug. So it's a compliance test, right? So hopefully you have a human that is answering the questions. Now, what you can also do is have one of the company's computer using the API and actually deciding on implementing a practice based on what the API will tell you, right? So you could connect a software with another software, which is the one that I just showed you, hence the word API. The idea of API is that you connect two software. Now, the dangers, if you do that, is that if you reach a state that is uncertain, your computer will implement or not implement the practice based on what appears. And often or sometimes, the analysis should be more granular. But as it stands, and I think the way it should be used is indeed as a compliance tool that will, at the very least, guide you, because in some cases, it's very obvious you are not infringing antitrust. If I go to my tying example, if you are providing two products that are not independent, then there is no tying. And it might be convenient for companies to be aware of that. And by the way, also for the lawyers, because it saves some time and you can actually redirect your clients to the API to answer the easy questions. In some other cases, it's clearly anti-competitive, right? If I take predatory pricing as an example, the legality test is quite clear. And depending on whether or not you are above or below the incremental cost, well, your practice is anti-competitive. Again, it's clear. And some other times you are right in the middle, something I will discuss in part 2. But long answer to your question, yes, it's a compliance tool.
Yeah, but it's amazing. Congratulations by now. And of course, I mean, I can see a multitude of applications of this tool you created. But I was thinking, we had a panel on ethical designing and on for antitrust, right? And we learned from the computer scientist. Actually, she's a mathematician doing computer science, and that the big data, I mean, that the raw material for the operation of such an API, for example, or such I mean, any kind of algorithm or software is usually biased, right? We can assume that there is no bias at all on the case law, because case law is it is decided. We just pick up the case law, and I mean, being fair enough to describe it to insert it into a big data or a realm or into this algorithm or this software. Okay, no bias at all. But in terms of behavior, registers of facts in the past, each society or each community may have its bias or their bias. So how would you conceal this? I mean, this is like bias in the raw to automatically reach out a result using your API.
Yeah. No, it could be a problem. I think so. Indeed, you have legality tests. Whether it is, I don't know, a proportionality test or as efficient competitor test, whatever it might be. There is no bias per se, as you just said, right? That's the legality test. We have case law, hundreds of cases. Okay. Where you could see bias is when comes the time to be more granular and apply the law to the specifics. And what I have in mind is the objective justification part, where in EU competition law, you can always, in theory, justify your practice. And here I could see indeed where there are biases, right, that may appear. Now, if you are to take the entirety of the case law and try to compute all the times where the court said, yes, this is a objective reason that is valid, and try to put that into the API, you will in a way compute the bias, right? Because that day, the defendant was this or that, and the judge decided to say this or that for this specific reason, but you have no idea that, it's the reason, or that they just had lunch. We had empirical study proving that after lunch, you tend to be more lenient. And so maybe a judge was more lenient on a case, the Intel case, I don't know which case, because it was just after lunch, and you will actually put that into the API. So you will have, the bias will be there. Now, it would still eliminate biases in a sense that at least, you could see what the law is, and potentially you avoid the bias of calling a console that may actually be biased towards, I don't know, generating more business and saying that you are in trouble when you are not, right? Or this kind of biases. So that's one issue. Something else that I would like to mention to answer your question is that what I'm not doing here is that I am not relying on machine learning. And so the system, as you could see, is based on decision trees. And in a sense, I control the exact output. I know precisely, if you answer the questions negatively or positively, where you will end up, which is not the case if you do not supervised but unsupervised machine learning, where you don't control the output. And this is where you may see lots of biases in the way by which the machine will cluster the data, because the machine may have been trained in a way that is biased. The very last point I want to make is this. We have regulation coming that you discussed, the AI Act in Europe, that tells you that your data sets should be free of error and non-discriminatory. It's nice. I mean, we wouldn't like the opposite, right? You wouldn't say, well, please train your system in a way that it's racist. Of course not. Now, the point is, if you want to train a system in a way that is non-racist, you need to have at least one data entry that represents the entirety of the population. So if we talk about human, different skin colors, different age, different backgrounds, you want to have all that. And from all that, you could generate plastic data, but different story for another day. You want at least one person per category. If you are prevented from getting access to the data because of GDPR for us in Europe or privacy laws, it might be that there is a trade-off you need to make as a company. Do I want to infringe the AI Act, or do I prefer to infringe GDPR or privacy law? And I think we may come to situations where companies really will face that choice, which is going to be fascinating for lawyers and academics, right? Maybe less fascinating for those companies.
Sure, thank you very much. Maybe the weight of the fine will tell them which risk they should take, right? But in any event, yeah. So.
No, I was about to say the AI Act, we know, at least according to the draft, it's 30 million or 6% of the global annual turnover. So, it's a lot, but maybe it's less than GDPR, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a lot. So, but I took other note, and but I'm sure I like it, the idea. I was not crystal clear about it, but now you explained it. So in fact, you're not dealing with machine learning. So you have one layer of a programming or programmation, and this layer is basically feeded by like case law, real case law, and you categorize it, if I understood accurately, the commands of each case law or each type of hypothesis, right? So as long as you have one layer, and I mean the very first input is from a human or a company, you mitigate a lot the biases history, right? Yeah.
So yes, I've done it myself. The decision trees. I got the help of fantastic researchers, but I've eventually had to check everything myself, that it complies with the case law and up to date with the Google Android case and a few others. I will, and this is what I mentioned in the conclusion, I will now try to design it in a way that is more advanced when it comes to computer science. My objective here was to do something with almost no code, so that everyone listening to us can actually do the exact same. Again, all explained in the paper, because some agencies I'm in touch with have just a handful of employees. They can't afford a computer scientist, and yet it would be nice if they were to develop this. So what I argue is that with just a few weeks of work and no computer science expertise, you could do it. Now, next step, we will do it in a more advanced way. One of the struggle I'm facing here is that if you are using machine learning to, let's say, provide the machine with a case law, and the machine will by itself come up with the rules, what's happening if you provide a case law that has been overturned by another one? I don't want the machine to train, the way by which we approach rebates and discounts according to the case law pre-Intel for us in Europe, because this is wrong. This is not valid anymore. And so if I'm to use just the Intel case, well, there is no machine learning capacity anymore because there is just one case and maybe a few implemented by the national agencies or before the courts in each jurisdictions. But the struggle is that, again, it's not as if you could take all the data and come up with the rules, because we do change legality tests, we do change the rules, and therefore I'm not sure we have enough material to train the machine. But we'll see, and I'm sure we're going to try to find ways to address that issue. But we'll see what we'll come up with.
I agree. And maybe if we think of parts, not training the machine, not allowing the machine to be trained, just feeding, autonomously feeding from data. But if maybe you thought this way already. But if you train, you can establish some programming or some commands to the machine for it to learn. For example, what is a price fixing, like a pure price fixing. So as long as the machine can identify a very equal price, this might be a class. Or if you can train a machine, okay, what is a discrimination of suppliers, for example, and you have like two universes and they are two samples, they are pretty much similar and they cannot be treated differently. So maybe this can be automatized. I don't know.
Yeah. Already. So again, yeah, the way I've done it is just the easiest way, I think. It requires expertise though, right? If you know nothing about competition, to be clear, if I wanted to create the same for tax law, or even worse for me, labor, worse because I know pretty much nothing about it, I'll do mistakes along the way in creating the trees. But for competition law, I felt comfortable. Now, there are more ways by which you could come up with something that will be similar on a user interface base. Now, the question is that, especially I see that with those agencies, they have a scarce budget, which means that they have to find ways to convince the top management and eventually the parliament to get more budget, that if they develop such a tool, it's effective and it works. And what we know here is that the costs are literally zero. So it's a good way for them, I guess, to approach the head of the agency and to say, well, just let me try. You put me on it for 3 weeks. I require nothing but coffee, and I develop the tool, and we see if it works. We'll see along the way. We're going to explore different ways. It might be that some will reach to better results, and the API, the interface, will be even more precise. But if they cost 2 million, I'm not sure this is worth it. And maybe it's worth it, but for political reason, the agencies won't develop it anyway. And if so, well, you have developed a beautiful proof of concept, but no one is using it, so there is no point. So there is a balance between cost and efficiency. And here I've been to one extreme, and now we're going to move to the other slowly.
Okay. Well, would you like to start the second session?
Of course, yeah. So,
thank you.
So far we've seen the concept of the API. Now, already, as you noticed, I wanted to quite a few times mention the limitations, and there are quite a few. And what, from an academic perspective, was fascinating to me is that I've learned a lot from it. And without creating this API, of course, we're all aware of some of the limitations of competition law, but not in those terms, or at least to me, that's been a very revealing process. So what do we see? We see that developing new tools, new solutions, such as the one that I just showed you, will actually eventually trigger some substantive questions. And from those questions, some of them will be left unanswered, but it may also be that it helps, the process of creating the tool helps to realize that we need to change the substance of the law and the way by which we design competition law. Maybe be more concrete. So this is what I showed you, right? So as you can see here, we have the decision tree when it comes to rebates and discounts. Again, I've divided it in two, but it should be just one big decision tree. And what you kind of see here is that there is the path that you should follow by answering the questions. But as I kind of mentioned already, there are post-its where I've put information. And the information that you have here is actually something that you do need to consider if indeed you are developing such an API. So let me be more concrete than that. What do you see over here? This one. What does it say? So the question that you should answer, should you reach that stage of the analysis, is whether or not your rebate was granted on business relationship that cover, I quote, a substantial share of the market. Now, to know whether or not you are covering a substantial share of the market with your rebate, you have to be able to know what the court means by substantial. If I continue the analysis, you will have to answer whether or not the conditions for your rebates are, I quote, capable of restricting competition. So here, not only you have to know the case law, but you also need the economic analysis, right? And talking about capability means that you need to forecast the future and try to imagine if indeed in the future you could create an effect on your competitors. And if I go on and on, you see that we indeed face those criteria. Is the rebate granted for a duration that is long? And is the rebate of a significant amount? Again, I quote the case law. This is not my language. And it seems to me that if you want to answer this one, you will have to know the case law. What is a long rebate? 6 months, 3 years, 10, 15? What is significant amount? Is it 10%, 50%, 90%? So you see, when you navigate and when you create the decision tree, that you are often facing questions that are very hard to answer. Now, this is just an overview. And what I want to do now is to actually take a step back and try to summarize all the limitations that I've seen in the way we design and think about antitrust. And I will take EU competition law as an example, but I'm convinced you have the exact same categories in Brazil and other countries. So first problem you may have to navigate the API, the lack of information. Now, to be clear, it might be that as a company, you lack information that you should have. A good example of that, I think, is the legality test we have for predatory pricing. You should know whether or not your rebate is above the long-run average incremental cost. This is data that you should and can have as a company, just internal data. If you have no idea what are the costs for you to make something, well, you can't assess whether or not you are engaging in predatory pricing, but you know what? Too bad for you. I think we can't expect the government or the agencies to help you in better knowing your business. So that's one type of problem. Another type of problem, though, which is more worrying, is when, as a company, you lack information that you cannot possibly have, and even worse than that, that you shouldn't have. Because if you do, it may trigger the desire to infringe competition law. Example, margin squeeze. In Europe, you should know whether or not the price that you impose for your competitor to access your infrastructure is actually to such a high degree that your competitor cannot cover their costs. It seems to me that first, you can't have that information because it will require for you to know what are the costs of your competitors. And even if you have that information, it seems to me a typical example where in a situation where you know precisely how much your competitors have to engage to produce something, it may trigger the need for you to abuse a dominant position where you would say, well, I'm aware of the cost. I know what you need, and therefore I will abuse my dominant position. I will lower the price or put a higher price depending on the strategy you want to implement if you don't sign an exclusivity deal with me, right? Or it could be a cartel. So that information you cannot have, and I think you shouldn't have, because if you do know the cost of your competitor, I could see how this is the road to cartel and abuses of dominance. So that's the first limitation, where as a company, you can't really navigate the tree. Limitation number two, I can tell you there are three in total. Number two, the lack of expertise. Here, I'm referring to economic expertise and legal expertise. Again, an example. For the rebate that I showed you, at some point in the decision tree, you have to answer whether or not your rebate excludes a as efficient competitor. Now, if you are competition lawyers, you know what it means, and you have a sense of how you could assess whether your competitors are as efficient as you are. Most likely, you can't do the analysis yourself because it requires economic skills. And I suppose in the law firm, in the competition agency, we could acquire that expertise. And I suppose a firm could acquire economic expertise, but do we want that? Do we want a firm to engage in economic expertise to be able to assess whether or not the firm complies with the law? Well, maybe not. And even legal expertise is problematic, as I mentioned to you. Exclusive dealing, you should address whether the practice is imposed on, I quote, many customers and over the long term. What is many, what is long term? You need to read the entirety of the case law. I don't know if you've seen our case law in Europe. Decisions now are 300 pages long. There are lots of them. It will basically require that you hire someone that is a competition law expert, even though you are a startup of 10 employees, right? If you don't do that, you can't navigate the API, full stop. And I'm not sure if this is the situation that we want. So already you see that not being able to navigate the API may indicate where we want to change the substance of what is competition law. Third and final limits, the nature of competition rules. And here, this is where I think that we have problems, but also for good reasons, and where potentially we should keep it as it is. In most of the legality tests, you have to probe the future. An example would be if you refuse to supply intangible assets, you have to address whether or not the practice, I quote, will limit the production of your competitors and their technical development. Now, first of all, again, you don't have that information. I'm not sure if you should have that information. And in any case, here we are asking whether or not in the future, your competitor will be less technically agile than without your practice being implemented. You can't possibly know that because we are asking you to forecast something which by definition you can't do. Now, is it a way for me to say that we should get rid of any type of legality test that is trying to probe the future? I think not, because if you are to do that, it means that by definition, you can never try to forecast the future, which means that you will only be in a position to rely on the past. So the consequence of that will be that every practice that is just being implemented and you know will produce an anti-competitive effect will have to be permitted, right? And you will have to wait for the practice to generate an effect and then look behind you and say, well, the practice was bad. So for that reason, we have to probe the future, but to some degree, you see where it's problematic for you to be able to navigate antitrust. Very last point, and I will finish there. Our Article 102, but same in pretty much every country, I believe, is non-limitative. So you know that certain practices are prohibited, but of course, new practices are being implemented and punished by the court. And the logic in the rule of law system is that the practice was always prohibited. It's just that it has never been implemented, right? So when the tribunal says that self-preferencing is prohibited, it's not saying that it was allowed in the past and now prohibited. It says, no, it has always been prohibited. It's just that we never had such a case, right? But by definition, as a lawyer, 10 years ago, you had no idea, most likely, what self-preferencing was, which means that when I design my decision tree, I only have branches that correspond to practices that are being litigated. I can't forecast which ones will come. And as I mentioned, the change in legality tests. The Intel case in Europe is a good example where we used to have 3 clear categories, and now, well, we kind of say we have 2. If it's purely based on quantity, legal per se, and the rest, you have to go through the criteria. Very, very last point is the one of objective reasons that I've mentioned already. There are very few objective reasons generally accepted by the courts. But again, it might be that you may want to go through the case law and implement that in the API. but you can always come up with a new objective reason that has never been raised before and that is perfectly valid. So at some point at the very end of the API, you often reach the conclusion your practice is most likely anti-competitive unless you have a good objective reason that could explain the practice. And we have the case law, it's the case 311/84 that tells you that indeed objective reasons there is no official list and should always be allowed by the courts. That is my email, my Twitter account, but we have more time for the discussion. But if you have more questions coming your way, whether you would like to design that in another jurisdiction, whether you would like to go that path for privacy law or whatever might be your expertise, I'm always happy to discuss. But for now, back to you, Eduardo, and to our conversation.
Sure. Well, appreciate it a lot. Thank you. Congratulations, Thibault. And while we were talking, I was like thinking of the first information, or actually acceptation. If I learned you invited everybody who's watching, I think I accept. I mean, I'm sure the IBCI and myself, including, would love to develop this API to our Brazilian case. We should talk about it afterwards and see how we can do it, even to antitrust. But I would suggest maybe to looking at privacy, and why not? And this is a question, like fake information or fake news. Have you thought about it? Because it's pretty much, at least to my end, it seems to be more easy or 0-1, digital, to determine whether any information is false or true, right? Of course, there's a lot. There is information subjected to interpretation, right? But a fact happen or not happen, maybe going to a more easy fact, easy evaluation, we can apply easy. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, so there are two ways by which you can design the API. The way I've done it, where you say, okay, I look at the case law, and if there are clear criteria in the case law, and implement that into an API. Now, in Brazil, I don't know if you have case law regarding fake news. In Europe, we have very few of those cases, which means that we don't have, a clear path that we could follow to get to know whether a news is fake or is not. It depends too much on the specifics. Now, it means that another way to develop the API, which is more complex, where you kind of design an expert system at least, is that you would say, okay, this is the path, but then I would need for my API to check whether or not the information is true versus other piece of information, right? So your API will have to access external data. It's doable. You need to link your API to, I don't know, Google News or the New York Times or the Guardian. Already, it will trigger lots of political questions. Why the New York Times? Why not? Why not the New York Post or the Washington Post or whatever journal? But it seems to me that at least in Europe, we don't have enough cases for those issues where indeed, right, you could reach a state of certainty as to whether a news is fake or not. Now, what's interesting, and I've mentioned that already, and out of all the limitations that I've presented, I think the conclusion is that it's a fantastic way for companies to at least be aware of what is competition and the logic behind it. Now, I think they should have a human behind and not, again, implement business decisions solely based on the API. But eventually we'll get there. And to some degree, if we have a great legality test, we should be in a position to do that, or at least we should be in a position to link that API to the business strategies where you will at least signal to people that this one might trigger warning when it comes to antitrust. Going back to your fake news example, let me take a concrete example. For those of you on Twitter, you may have seen that if you are trying to retweet something that you haven't read, an article, Twitter will ask you, are you sure about that? And don't you want first to read the article? Now, if you are the author of the article, it's hilarious. It happened to me. So of course, I won't read my own stuff. So but that aside, it tells you that you could indeed, it's basically a decision tree behind, right? Or it was trained with machine learning, but it comes to the same kind of conclusions. And instead of having the system making a decision that is highly coercive, that would just say, no, you can't retweet. You haven't read, you can't retweet. The system would just trigger a warning. And this is the kind of thing that I would like to see when it comes to competition law, tax, privacy, where we could at least have a system that is directly linked to the database of the company and trigger lots of warnings. Then you need to have a human behind, right? But for now, I just envision that you do it in a totally independent way. And we have a book, and I'll finish there, by Nick Bostrom on superintelligence. And he's making a point that indeed, we should try to design system, AI system, in a way that is not connected to the real world. So we can always check their output before we implement it in our real physical world. Yeah,
well, it may be difficult. I mean, I agree that we also, the antitrust field, we have this like I'm not if it's a good or bad output, but we are pretty much on the same page in terms of concepts and process and theories of harm and so forth and so on. So it's pretty much like a global area. I mean, very few idiosyncrasies per country,
and, yeah, you could to some degree develop an API for the entire world. Now, it will actually beg very interesting questions where you will have to direct the companies to the relevant jurisdiction. And there you see it's not that easy, right? Because what would you ask? Are you a Brazilian company? Well, are you doing business in Brazil? If you answer yes, does it mean we only apply Brazilian competition law to you? What if you also do business in Europe? Well, then you need to apply the two, right? So it will be interesting to try to design and think about ways to direct the companies. I had this discussion actually with Doug Melamed from Stanford, where he said, well, one of the trick in what you are trying to do is, first, how do you direct the companies toward the right analysis, toward the right practices? And that's why I came up with this idea of clustering practices into price or non-price strategies, and then asking, are you interested? But you could do better than just, are you interested? If you use the API and answer no to all of my questions, are you interested? It would just say, well, then have a good day and, enjoy. But you could do better than that.
Yeah, but have you thought about designing a decision tree for a merger test?
Yeah, that would be quite easy, I think. And I mean, when it comes to,
I would say with less limitations, right?
Yeah, less limitations. Yeah. Yeah, quite easy again to, at least for the big lines. Then when it comes to whether or not the turnover should be the one of the entire group or just the target, and whether or not there is enough control, this is where the analysis must be more granular. And I remember working on such cases where at some point we were facing an issue where we were basically saying, okay, if there is not enough control for us to consider the turnover of the entire target, which we didn't want, because if we were to do that of the entire group, we're above the threshold. But if not enough control, then it means that there are independent undertakings on the market, and what they are doing might be a cartel. So also something that we don't want. And that is where eventually one day it might be interesting to have a merger control API, where at some point, depending on what you answer, you go to the cartel API, which is already what I've done for Article 102, abuses of dominance. If you use the one for patent holdup, it will ask you whether or not the patent is part of a standard, and depending on what you answer, it redirects you to other practices, namely here, tying. So it's very interesting, at least from an academic perspective, to try to think, okay, what is the link between all of those practices? And sometimes, it's quite artificial. Why do we decide that Google Shopping is it's not a case of discrimination? It's very artificial. It could have been done that way. And doing it, you see all the limits.
Yeah, but I agree that behavioral cases are a lot more attractive than mergers, right, for antitrust practitioners. But I must tell you, I think we have. I think, and I know the Brazilian system a lot. I'm sure we can. We can design together a decision tree for merger test in Brazil. Why not offer to like a sample like a test, a try to the authority. And I'm inclined to tell you they will love it, because we have I mean, in terms of the ambiguity terms, we have a huge amount of tests so far, and so I would say like we have a 99% tested that we can in terms of case law to answer the question, to create this API, this subject to design a decision tree, to let people, I mean, by themselves without a lawyer, to just fill up the test and have the answer. Okay, you have a mandatory submission merger where you should do it before, you should not close the transaction, and you will avoid a heavy fine. So you avoid a gun jumping problem.
So again, and you know, if you haven't practiced competition law, at least in all the law firm where I've practiced, we were using Getting the Deal Through, or one of those other sources, right? Where you say, oh, wow, the target's actually active in Slovenia. I have no idea what's merger control. Can I get, you know, basically the decision tree so I can do the analysis and then give it to my clients? So to know whether or not you have to notify, I could see how you could do it very easily. Now, for the second step of the analysis, where you try to assess whether or not there are competitive risk with the merger, this is where, again, you need real world, meaning outside the agency world data, right? You need for the company to be able to evaluate what is the relevant market. And very often it's not that clear from the case law. And even if it is clear, you need to again, ask what are the shares of the competitors, and lots of information that you can't just gather using the case law, where you have to ask for the companies to actually enter information that I'm not sure companies can have. So we reach the same conclusion. You know, we've all done that. What are the market shares of your competitor? Let me see. I think they are very high, right? This is always what you would say when you notify a merger, because it means that you are smaller than what you are in the real space. And to be fair, yes, of course, you don't have what are the revenues of your competitors per relevant market, especially if the market is such as there are. I've worked on cases where there were 400 relevant markets just in France. I don't know what is the turnover of my competitor in all of those markets. And therefore, how do you navigate the API? You can't. But does it mean that then we need to change the way by which we do antitrust? Because if you can't navigate the API, it basically means that you can't navigate antitrust even without the API. So it tells something very interesting.
Yeah, we should talk later about it, because it's been 10 years. We don't have this market share criteria so far. In Brazil, we only have like the turnover criteria, and it's like it's digital, you know, turnover last year. And the only
that is for notification, right? But then what about the analysis? After you know you've had to notify, then you analyze the market share.
Yeah, no, for the analysis, you're right. So it depends on the definition, and it depends on what is the market definition, relevant market definition. You reach out to the higher or lower market share. You're right, but I would tell you, I mean, it would be a great step forward for us to, I mean, to have a tool that where people can simply fill up and have an answer. Okay, a clear, a strong indication that you have a, I mean, a mandatory case to be taken to the agency. You know, don't close, don't share information now. Protect yourself. You know, because I don't know if it's good or bad, but we are still in the. We have a lot of this problem still in Brazil. So many jumping cases, and an API like this would help a lot. You know.
And again, we come back to the same idea. Most companies want to be compliant. It's just really hard to navigate, right? They don't enjoy doing gun jumping, and so if you were to tell to those companies, well, if you share information right now, just so you know, you get fined, they won't do it for the most part. So that is where I see that agencies may have a role to play in giving access to those APIs and developing those APIs with all the warnings that you want. Not perfect, not complete, don't take it for granted, but it triggers the right questions.
Yeah, all right. We have a question. I mean, First, to tell you this question, I mean, I think you have access to the questions those in the chat.
Yeah.
But I would like to give a special thanks to our co-chair Vinicius Klein, without whom this conference would not be possible. So Vinicius, thank you very much for, I mean, with me organizing this and doing a lot more work, hard work behind the scenes to make it's true again. Thank you very much. Congratulations. So Vinicius have a question. You may read, Thibault, please.
Yeah. So the API, the question is, the API could be a compliance mechanism, what we discussed. What do you think about being mandatory imposed by competition agencies as a behavioral remedy? I haven't thought about that. So the way it could work, I think I see different levels against different coercive levels. And this is what I often like with these types of solution, is that you could try with, you know, the least coercive, and should it work eventually gradually go to the more coercive solution. So the least one would be to say, okay, you've been sanctioned, and Vinicius, please, if you have something else in mind, just intervene. But the least coercive I see is that you've been sanctioned. Now we just give you access to the API, and please just have a look next time you do something, because you won't like to see us again, right? Especially for the same practice. I don't know how the law is in Brazil, but in Europe, you get, of course, fined for the second practice, plus we double the amount of the fine because you've done it already.
Same here. Same here.
So, well, it could be, you know, non-coercive, just a friendly advice given by the agency to the company. And I will see no reason why the company wouldn't do that. I mean, to navigate the API again, I can go back to it. Where is it? Yes, it's here. And you know, it literally takes a few seconds for you to navigate the API. So if I go back to, okay, let me do it again. Go back to my example, and let's navigate the pricing strategies. Okay, so yes, pricing strategy. Do I care about price discrimination? Well, yes, I want to check that. Okay, are you charging different prices for the same products to your business partner? Well, yes, I'm doing that. Okay, then there are 3 ways. Strategy number 1, are you charging different prices depending on your business partner nationality? No, I'm not. Oh, okay, then are you doing it based on where they are located, right? So just to say, to navigate the API will take literally 10 seconds. And I wouldn't see why companies wouldn't enjoy having access to the API. So that's one way. A more coercive way is to say to a company, you're gonna find a way to make the API output coercive, meaning that if the API says that you shouldn't implement a practice, then you can't do it. One way to achieve that result is to use blockchain and smart contracts and impose to tie the database of a company by way of smart contract, and therefore you are sure as an agency that the company will have to comply with the code of the smart contract. But is it too coercive? I think the answer for now is yes, because often you reach conclusions that deserve to be more nuanced than what appears. So I think it's better to offer that in a non-confrontational way to companies, rather than imposing that companies have to tie their business relationship strategy, to that API. I don't know, Vinicius, if you had something else in mind, but I'm sure there are many things and ideas that I haven't thought of with this specific API and similar ones.
Well, thank you, Vinicius, and thank you, Thibault. I think we can do a lot of tests using this API, for sure. And again, I'm interested in developing to the Brazilian case, Thibault. So let's talk about it after this event, maybe next weeks or so.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm sure we can design something for specifically and easily for the like a local merger test. And
yeah,
why not? We can make it available. I mean, for free to people try and using the IBCI page, and they can just try. Why not?
Yeah, and what I've done here is that I'm not tracking the data. I don't have access to the data. So if you use the API, I don't even see what you are doing. Now, what you can also do, but I didn't want to have privacy issues, but you could say, okay, I just want to see where people navigate without getting access to their identity. But I didn't want to be in a situation where this could be considered as personal data and infringing the law. But this could also be something that agencies, if designed properly, may enjoy, because if you see that every company using the API is asking about predatory pricing, it means they are scared of that. So it means that, one, the case law is not clear. Two, this is a type of practice that they may be tempted to implement. So it tells something, right? And all that to say that there are different ways by which you can design the API, track the use, and potentially adapt based on what you see. But yes, again, there are many different things that you can do. And I see that Vinicius says that I answered the question. So
okay,
quite happy.
You answered, for sure you answered. So I have no further questions. I don't know if the audience would have some other questions. Otherwise, we can go to the conclusion of the panel. And I know it's late in Holland. You must be a little tired, Thibault.
Yeah, maybe while people type a question, if they do, the point I want to make is that two things. First, almost by definition, the API is static. It's based on what exists. Now, if you talk about dynamic competition, you may talk about new ways by which the companies will compete, which is most of the time good, but sometimes it might be that those new ways are anti-competitive. By definition, the API can't address those, right? If a practice has never been before the agency, it's outside of the API. That's the first point. The second point, though, is that, as we discussed, there are limitations regarding the way by which we address competition law. The API makes those limitations very clear, and this might be where, indeed, we want to change the rules and try to embed dynamism in the way by which those rules are designed, right? So instead of measuring market power, just looking at the turnover, it might be, or asking for other metrics that companies can't answer. So if you do answer, no, I don't represent more than 50% of the shares of my market, then you will get to questions such as, what about your competitors? And what about the barrier to entry? It might be that this is where we want to change the rules so that they are more dynamic in nature, and try to forecast whether or not there is uncertainty on the market, whether or not the market is complex, meaning that to produce something, you need to have relationship with many companies. So I think this API may be a good way for us to start thinking about new ways by which we can design competition law that are more in line with what we see, which is dynamic competition. And I think that if we design the rules that way, it will become easier for company, because it will better match with what they see on the ground, right? As opposed to just looking at pictures and trying to assess business practices that way. So as you know, Eduardo, we've been researching dynamic competition and those issues for quite some time. And I really see that thinking about new ways, new tools is actually just the other side of the coin that actually leads to the very same conclusion, which is that we need to change some of the rules of competition law and make them more dynamic. So hence the title of the panel.
For sure. And I can clearly see, lots of positive outcomes in using such new tools to help firms and companies complying with the law. I mean, I'm sure, in majority, they want to comply. They want to comply, and as they get large, sometimes it gets difficult for them to comply with all the rules. But it's not an intentional infringement. This is my feeling.
Two last points. First, if you design that API for competition law, the same for, in Europe, Data Act, the same for Data Governance Act, AI Act, the DSA, the DMA, you will see that sometimes they conflict. And that will appear very clearly when you try to connect those trees. You will see, oh, but wait, we ask for one question here, another question here. And based on what they answer, we get to a different result. What do we do? So it would make it clear that we need to make them more better integrated. That's the point number one. The other point that I wanted to mention is that some of my friends here in Amsterdam, they run startups, and they ask me questions about competition law. I'm pleased. Of course, it's great. They know about my field of research. On the other end, they have 1, 2, 3, 4 employees, and they really spend time trying to understand, read the case law. So I'm not here to say this is bad, this is good, it's part of a good culture. But do I really want my friends to spend 50% of the time, trying to assess their compliance with competition law instead of building a product? Well, we've been maybe a bit too far. I think with this kind of solutions, we give them a way to, rest assured that they answer no to the question, which is often my analysis. Are you in a dominant position? Well, no, we're not. We're not making any business. We have no customer, no client. And therefore, well, you know what? Abuses of dominance, you worry about that later. But for now, you're all good. Just using the API, they can realize that they're all cleared, at least for Article 1 or 2, which is otherwise not something that a conclusion they will get to, because they will not hire a lawyer that will tell them that they don't have to worry about abuses of dominance without dominant position. So they will keep that in mind and worry about it. So again, as you say, those solutions may enable more dynamism on the market because it may free some, minds and time.
Of course, and as we have some minutes, just share something. If Vinicius asked about making the API mandatory, right, in terms of a compliance, a mandatory compliance test for the agency impose or the law, the regulation would impose, and hypothetically this test, like the API, as a mandatory compliance test. Well, let's say if we can see it from another angle, not making it mandatory, but it's optional, but the agency could rely on it to release people to behave in any way. For example, in terms of mergers, if the agency offers, let's say the Brazilian agency, they offer, you can test, you can use our tests, and our tests tells you you're free, you're free. You should not pay the mandatory filing fee. 85,000 reais. You are free to go,
Yeah.
So shifting the incentives, it's not mandatory, but I would love to choose for the test because I may be free.
Yeah. This is where, again, you need clear criteria, because you could always say, okay, let's say you navigate the API, you get a PDF, you could do that very easily, where you see all the answers that you've provided. If you are then to implement the practice and get fined by the agency, the company would say, okay, no, look, I've been through the API. It works only if the agency can't argue against the way by which you've answered the questions, right? So
right.
If one of the criteria is long-term and you've answered no, the agency could say, oh, but you were wrong on that. This was long-term because you've imposed it for 10 years. If on the contrary, you have clear criteria, are you above the average total cost? The answer is yes or no. And then if you answered properly, then this could indeed be something you want to show the agency. So we come back to the very same conclusion. If you want to make it concrete and helpful, we have at some point to think about new ways by which we can design the legality test and change the substance of what is competition law. But I very much like your idea otherwise.
Yeah, we cannot use for all matters, every matter. But I'm sure, not half, but 30% of the matters, we can use such a way, to let people automatically have an answer, as long as they are honest in fulfilling the form. And uploading the information, and of course, it's really easy to establish incentives for them to be honest. Yeah, and we are going to at least 30%. We will be 30% faster. 30% is a lot, my friend.
Yeah, it's actually more. There are limitations on those trees, but there are more trees where there is no post-it and no limitations, right? Where the test kind of works. So yeah, again, the idea is to design incentives so that the bad people will be forced to, answer in a true way, in a true manner to those trees. We may want to think about those incentives, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, just a matter of risk. It's to me is a matter of risk. Raising up the risks for them to lie, so they will not lie. At least in majority. Okay. Well, I love the discussion. Always love to discuss with you, my friend. I'm one of your fans, one of my favorite professors, Thibault, and I thank you very much for your time, your generosity. You know, as you know, and everybody who's watching, this is a pro bono initiative. Nobody's earning a coin, nothing to do this, and we do for love. So thank you all. Thank you all to be with us from October 19th until now, and especially thanks to Thibault. I would thanks Professor Juliana Domingues as well, because behind the scenes she helped a lot in organizing the event and selecting the panelists, and struggling with some panelists to persuade them to give time to the event, and she succeeded. And thank you, Juliana. I appreciate it a lot, and IBCI appreciate a lot your help. Thibault, thank you again. I hope to talk to you soon about this this new idea, and of course, let's do something in the future. Why not in presence?
Yeah. Of course, very pleased to be there, and yeah, see you very soon. Bye bye.
See you soon. Bye bye.